Well, good morning. Nice to see everyone here this morning. I want to welcome our visitors. We're glad you're with us. You are our honored guest. Over the course of the last 2 weeks, we've been looking at the running theme on Sunday morning of looking at marriage, and on Sunday night, looking at different aspects of David's life. Today and tonight are going to be no different. This morning, we're going to be looking at marriage communication. Over the last 2 weeks, we looked through Ephesians, we looked into Colossians and 1 Peter 3:7, and we looked at the God-given roles and responses of husbands and wives. This morning, I want us to look at communication and see that it is what strengthens the tie that binds. Without communication, marriages would be in disarray and would fall apart. Communication solves many misunderstandings. In our text, it says text, I put that there for lack of a better word, Romans 12, 9 through 13 and verse 16. We're actually going to read a little part of this, maybe in the middle, and we're really going to read this in its entirety at the end as we conclude after we talk about the things we're going to be looking at. But communication solves many misunderstandings and can reduce drama in relationships. As I have said the last 2 weeks, for those that are not yet married, those looking to get married or plan to one day, and those who have been married for a long time, these are lessons of reminders. These are things for those that are looking to be married, things to be looking for in a spouse, looking for in a mate, things to be planning on, that when that relationship develops, when you leave father and mother and you cleave to your husband or your wife, these are things and practices that will grant you success, at least as far as your God-given role and response and in your communication. I want you to think about something with me. Many stories, and I would use books, movies, TV, whatever medium you look at for your stories, many stories wouldn't have a plot, or it would be over in the first 5 minutes if there was proper communication. Right? How frustrating is that? Becky and I sit there and we scream at the TV. If you would have only just talked about it or said something, we wouldn't have had to sit through an hour and a half or whatever it is for you to figure it out. And we think that's so contrived, it's so forced. But then we wonder why on earth are story after story after story written that way. The writers, and they're not always the same writer, the writers write these stories, whether it's in book form or it gets translated into the big screen, they write these things because it's their life experiences. It's things that actually happen. Drama and conflict seems to be forced or created for these stories through lack of communication. In fact, a lot of books that Becky and I will finish reading, and we'll slam it down and say that entire story was the consequence of a lack of communication. Or some show we'll watch and say if it wasn't for the lack of communication, that wouldn't have even been a story. But yet we see it time and time again. Not only perhaps in our own lives, but in the lives of others, family members, friends of ours, we see that lack of communication and the trouble that it brings with it. Sometimes it may not be a lack of communication, but a misunderstanding of the way it is communicated. And while it's frustrating, it seems like it could all be resolved in the first few minutes, and I'm still talking about these stories that we watch. These problems do mirror life, and it's why it's prevalent in storytelling throughout time. So many stories throughout time begin with a lack of communication, a misunderstanding of communication, and the plot thickens. I want to share with you a small story from something that personally happened, that if it were a sitcom or drama, and someone was writing, think of all the hilarity that may have ensued afterwards. Just to give you a little background, the way Becky and I have established our shopping day, we'd go shopping together, grocery shopping, and she'll go grocery shopping, and when the kids were really little, I took the kids. And I would take them separately. I had my own cart, and I would throw them in the cart when they were really little, and then as they got older, I realized I don't need a cart, and we just go do our own thing. And then Becky got her grocery shopping done fast. As they got older, on occasion, they would say, I want to go with Mommy, and the other one would say, I want to go with Daddy. And so that'd be fine. But we told them, you have to let us know when we get before we get in through the door, so we all know which direction we're going. And there's many times that we would look at things together before we separated to our own things. Well, one particular day, as we were going into the store, Lana said, I want to go with Mommy. And so I said, okay. And I had my own mission of things I had to pick up, and our anniversary was right around the corner, so I was making a trip to the jewelry department of this particular store. And so I had my own little list of things I was going to get. We get into the electronics department, and I turn around, and Alana's right behind me. And I said, "What are you doing?" "I thought you were going with Mommy." And she said, "I am. I thought she came in here with you." And I said, "No. She's gone on shopping. I have this list here, and then I'm going somewhere else." And she started just crying. She's maybe 6, 7 years old. She bursts into tears, and she says, "I want to go with Mommy." And I said, "It's too late. I'm not going to chase her down through the store. Now you're with me until we catch up with her." So I finished up there in the electronics department. We get into the jewelry department, and I'm shopping, and I'm doing my thing, and she's just bawling. And the lady notices that she's just in tears. She's inconsolable. And I'm trying to work with her, and I'm trying to take care of Alana. And finally, there's a break. The lady is got my order, and she's wrapping it up. And so I took Alana aside, and I knelt down, grabbed her shoulders as gently as I could, and I looked into her weeping eyes, and I said, "Sweetie, Mommy and Daddy are separated right now, and I don't know when we'll see her again." I heard a sound behind me. And I'm on my knees, and I look up, and there's this older lady with her hand over her heart. She's like, "Oh!" And it took me a minute. I looked at her, and I looked back at Alana, and I finally went, "No!" And it was too late. She's gone. She moved in I lost her in the crowd. I went in to say, "No, that's not what I meant." So later, when we did find Becky later on, I told her, I said, "Somewhere out there's an older lady here who's going to think you're the other woman." So Alana knew what I was saying, but it might have been worded in a better way for all the busy crowds around us. Communication is a building block of any successful relationship. As we talked about this morning in our adult Bible class, God communicates to us through words. He communicated with us through the Holy Spirit. He communicates with us through His Son. Hebrews 1, 1-2. Acts 20, verse 32 says He used to communicate in various different ways with the forefathers, but now in these last times He speaks to us through His Son. Children of God communicate with the Father through prayer, Matthew 6, 9. Parents and children must talk with each other. In fact, we know that fathers specifically are mentioned in Ephesians 6:4 as being able to instruct their children in the knowledge of God. We can't do that unless we talk with them, we spend time with them. Husbands and wives must communicate effectively to strengthen that tie that binds. And 1 Peter 3:7 says the husbands must live with their wives in an understanding way. That makes it a two-way street. The wife needs to communicate to her husband. The husband needs to take that communication and understand it and be able to live together. Doing this reduces drama in marriage. So the question we're going to be asking this morning and looking at 6 different things is this. Why do husbands and wives fail to effectively communicate? Why is there a failure in communication? We're going to look at 6 things. After the first 3, we're going to look at a solution and goal. After the second list of 3, we're going to look at a solution and goal, and then we'll conclude this morning's lesson. All 6 of these things, this is not all inclusive. These are 6 things that we have experienced either personally, whether friends around us or things that happened between me and Becky. These are things that we know from experience. As we go through these things, you might have your own list. You might come up with your own reasons. And feel free, if you'd like, to share those with me or work on the solutions to those things in your own relationships or those around you if you're able to give aid and help. Why do husbands and wives fail to effectively communicate? Maybe because they begin taking each other for granted. The first one on the list, and these are in no particular order, they begin taking each other for granted. And this probably wasn't always the case. Love does not assume or take for granted, but love cherishes and delights in the one that it loves. Taking a passage from the Song of Solomon in chapter 2 and verse 3. It says, "Like an apple tree among the trees of the forest, so is my beloved among the young men. In his shade I took great delight and sat down, and his fruit was sweet to my taste." If you go to chapter 3 and read the first passages there, all the way from verses 1 to 4, you find where she says she sought for, quote, "him whom my soul loves," end quote, throughout the city late at night. She even went to the night watchman saying, "Have you seen him for whom my soul loves?" And she didn't rest until she had found him. When you love someone, you'll do all that you can to ensure the safety of that person, to care for his or her needs, even at a cost of your own personal comfort. This is demonstrated most often in small actions. Getting your spouse a glass of water. You know, we talk about, when I got married, I'd always heard about the kids right at bedtime going down and asking, "Can I have a glass of water?" What I wasn't told is sometimes your spouse asks that. We get up, we lose that comfort that we might have to do something for our loved one, whether it's for our wife or our husband or our child. Sometimes you're leaving work early to attend that function that your child has, or you're leaving work early or doing whatever it else is to ferry your spouse somewhere that they need to be. You sacrifice your personal comfort to tend to the needs of your family. You need to notice what each other does for the other and show appreciation. It's so easy to take for granted the things that are done for us. I know in my own life, sometimes it's easy to take for granted the things Becky does. She makes my life so much easier. We can't do those things. We can't take those things for granted. We need to recognize it and show appreciation. Showing appreciation goes a long way. You know, there's a phrase from the world. The world says familiarity breeds contempt. But that's not what we read in the Scriptures. God's way says, get familiar and stay that way. In Genesis 2:18, when we talked about the wife's God-given role as being that suitable helper, you are that suitable helper. And as such, the husband and wife are to leave father and mother. They are to join to one another, cleave or cling to one another, and become one flesh. Matthew 19:4-6, Jesus said, from the beginning, it was that a husband and wife start that new family. They cleave to one another. Familiarity breeds contempt only when there is a lack of communication, when contempt for one another happens, and that often happens by taking one another for granted. Why do husbands and wives not communicate effectively? Sometimes it's because their personality is they want to avoid a confrontation. And so past conflicts get in the way. Past conflicts prevent present communication. We talked about in the last 2 weeks Proverbs 21:9 and verse 19, and just to remind ourselves of it, we're going to read verse 9 and verse 19. It says, it's better to live in a corner of a roof than in a house shared with a contentious woman. Verse 19, it's better to live in a desert land than with a contentious and vexing woman. Sometimes we can convince ourselves that talking just won't do any good. We react in negative ways. And so we tell ourselves, I can't say anything to her, I can't say anything to him because it won't do any good. They won't change their way. They're only going to react negatively. They're not going to take it. They're not going to show appreciation. They're not going to want to take time to spend with me. They're not going to want to talk it out. Before services this morning, Lori handed me a picture, and I can tell you if I had it, I would have put it in this lesson. It shows a woman with her arms crossed. And she has a very grumpy look on her face, and there's a guy behind her with his eyes all wide, and he's kind of wringing his hands together, and it says, behind every angry woman stands a man, ... who has absolutely no idea what he did wrong. Why? Why would that happen? And we laugh because we know this happens. But why? Because communication isn't happening. She's either not communicating to him, saying, "Oh, he'll just won't get it. He won't understand it." He's not asking what's wrong, probably because he knows she'll snap at him or just keep silent about it. We need to break the cycle of silence and avoidance. Colossians 4:6 says, "Let your speech always be with grace, as though seasoned with salt, so that you'll know how you should respond to each person." So often we use this passage and we say, this is the passage that tells us that when those opportunities knock and we're to share the gospel, this tells us how we ought to do that. Well, if this fits that scenario, it certainly fits with the way we talk to our spouse, the one that we are to cleave together with and become one flesh with. If we're to talk to our brethren this way, if we're to talk to people in the world this way, then we certainly ought to be talking to our spouses in this way, with this attitude. Let our speech always be with grace, as though seasoned with salt, so you'll know how you should respond to each person. Break the cycle of conflict, silence, and avoidance. So many people say, well, we have so much history together. We have so much baggage. There are so many different past conflicts that we just don't want to talk now in the present. And the situation doesn't get better. It gets worse. Break the cycle of conflict. Break the cycle of silence. Break the cycle of avoidance with a soft answer. Proverbs 15, 1-2 tells us a soft answer turns away wrath. Not in accusing tones, by always thinking the best of each other. 1 Corinthians 13:5, in describing love, the Holy Spirit through Paul says, love does not take into account a wrong suffered. And yet, how many of us do that? Well, we remember when. Love does not take into account a wrong suffered. It will not accuse. We can break the cycle by stopping the arguing and reconcile. Proverbs 20 and verse 3 says, any fool will fight, but the wise will reconcile. And that's true. Any fool will fight over anything, right? But how many of us do that in our own relationships, where we're just willing and ready for the fight? Matthew 5:23-24, in talking about our brethren, says, if you recognize your brother has something against you, go to him before you take your offering to God. It says, be reconciled to him. If that works for our brother, then it certainly ought to work for our spouse. That if there's something between us, we ought not let the sun go down on our anger, right? We need to reconcile to fix that. We're not to hold things over one another's head. We need to break the cycle with a real commitment to listen to each other. James 1:19 tells us, and we talk about it all the time, in exercising self-control, that we are to be slow to speak and quick to hear. Right? We're to be able to listen, but we're to be slow to speak. But how many of us, when that conflict arises, we both have the words on the tip of our tongues, ready to go at each other's throats, right? That shouldn't be how it is. We need to break that cycle. No matter what the past conflicts were, we can do it differently. We can do it better in the present. We can break the cycle by removing wrath from your heart. And we have certainly known people who have wrath in their heart toward their spouse. It's in the way they talk about them. It's in the way they talk to them. You need to remove that. You know, about a week after Becky and I returned from our honeymoon, it was actually the following Sunday, we were in the adult Bible class, and the teacher separated us into men and women. And I don't even remember that group exercise because of what happened. We were talking a little bit about marriage relationships, but the exercise for the men and for the women was something completely not even relevant to talking about a relationship, but we were to discuss something and then give an answer. Well, talking with Becky later, she had the same situation that I did. When we got in this circle of men, every last one of them began bashing their wives for the previous week or beyond. And one of them, and I'm sitting there just in a bewildered silence, and one of them says, hey, Nate just got married. We're going to scare him. We need to stop this and get back to the task at hand. And one of them said, he just got married. He needs to know. And they just kept on going. And after the project, when the teacher asked for our answer, someone just got up and said something that none of us even discussed. Becky told me, that was awful. When we got together with the women, all they did was sit around and bash their husbands. I learned stuff about people here that I never wanted to know. And I said, that happened with me too. It shouldn't be that way. We shouldn't take the first opportunity we have to tell one another how bad and rotten our spouse has been to us. And that goes, as we experienced, it goes both ways. It's not just the women that do it to their husbands. It's the husbands that say it about their wives as well. We need to remove the wrath from our hearts. Why do husbands and wives not communicate effectively? Sometimes it's because they're certainly obsessed with their own interests. 1 Corinthians 13:5 says, love does not seek its own. Translation of that means love is not selfish. And this picture shows two people doing their own thing, and I'm not saying that there's not a time and place for that. But when it comes time to communicate, to talk with our spouse, if we're so busy doing any and everything that we want to do that we're not taking the time to talk, we're too busy. Certainly there's times where Becky and I both are on a device, and I know many of you do the same, and I'm not saying that's wrong. But if that's all you do, and you don't take the time to talk and communicate, that might be a reason why that communication is not happening effectively. Philippians 2:3-4 says, "Do nothing from selfishness or empty conceit, but with humility of mind regard one another as more important than yourselves. Do not merely look out for your own personal interests, but also for the interests of others." We often use this passage in the attitude we are to have towards our brethren. But as we looked at in Ephesians chapter 5, where with the parallel of the marriage relationship and the church to Christ, when it says that Jesus gave himself up for the church, he loved her so much, and that husbands are to give themselves to their wives in the same way, this passage certainly tells us that it applies to our marriage relationship. That we're not to merely look out for our own interests, but the interests of others. And in the marriage relationship, we're to look out for the interests of our spouse and when it comes to our children. The sin of selfishness. This means no self-control. 2 Timothy 3:3, Galatians 5:23 tells us self-control is a fruit of the Spirit. And if we look in 2 Timothy 3:3, we find there are those in the world, these troublesome times that arises from men who have no self-control. So how and where we spend our time, our money, our interests equates to value. What happens over time is we tell our spouse where they fit in our list of value. If we're so obsessed with our own interests that we're not taking the time to culture that relationship, we're telling our spouse, whether it's in our words or just through our actions, where they rank on our list of value. It equates to value, our devotion, our security, and our trust. In Luke chapter 12 and verse 15, Jesus, right before he talks about the rich fool, he says, life does not consist of possessions. In Matthew 16:26, Jesus said, "What profit is there if a man were to gain the whole world and lose his soul?" In 1 Corinthians 13:5, it says, "Love is not selfish. It does not seek its own." So a husband whose first priority, his first concern is his own satisfaction, is not following Christ. Remember Ephesians 5:25, it says, "As Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her, husbands are to love their wives in that same manner, being willing to give up anything for her." So husbands, if you're so devoted to everything that you want to do, to the point that your wife is being ignored, you need to break that cycle. You need to stop that. 1 Timothy 5:8 tells husbands we have that role as provider. And it's not enough just to provide and say, well, I put food on the table, I work, then I want to do whatever I want to do. No, that's not enough. We have to be willing to give ourselves up for our wives. And a wife whose first concern is her own pleasure is not following Christ. The church is to submit to Christ, and in so doing, so is the wife to submit to her husband. Ephesians 5:22 and 24, Proverbs 31:27. A wife's first priority is to her family. She's that suitable helper. She's that homemaker, the one that manages or rules the house. That's her special role. And if she's obsessed with her own interests, then she's not following Christ. So what is the solution? Make an effort to be interested in what interests your spouse. Look with me in Ecclesiastes chapter 4. Ecclesiastes chapter 4 and verse 9. It says, "Two are better than one because they have a good return for their labor. For if either of them falls, the one will lift up his companion. But woe to the one who falls when there's not another to lift him up. Furthermore, if two lie down together, they keep warm. But how can one be warm alone?" Remember what drew you to your spouse in the first place. What were the interests that they had, he or she had, that drew you to them? I remember a visiting preacher that came to Alaska for a gospel meeting. This was years and years ago. And after the morning service, we had a potluck, and later in the week, I met with him for lunch, just one-on-one, him and I. And before we even really got talking, he leaned into me and he said, "What was the deal at the potluck?" And I started thinking back to the potluck, and I said, "Well, what deal?" And he said no matter what table he went to, the men and women both were talking about the things they did outdoors together. Because in Alaska, our congregation, we had there was lots of outdoor things to do, and so many husbands and wives enjoyed hunting, fishing, hiking, boating together. And they were telling him all these different stories, and I wasn't understanding what he was saying. And he says, where I come from, in Indiana, he said, the only time husband and wives are outdoors together is if his wife drags him to the mall to go shopping. And I said, what? And he said, it was unheard of. He said, when he was listening to the husbands and wives all talking about all the different things we did outdoors together, he said, it was blowing his mind. And he said, that's not the type of conversations he hears back in his own congregation. And I couldn't help but think, that's sad. We ought to be engaging in one another's interests with our spouse. Make an effort to be interested, even if it's not something you personally want to do, at least show interest in it. Be supportive of something that they want to do, something that brings them joy and comfort. Do things together, whether it's with your children or recreation together. Take time out of the busy workday and do something fun together with you and your spouse. Do something fun with you and the kids. Also, nurture your shared faith, especially for husbands and wives who are brothers and sisters in Christ. Study, pray together. Do these things together that build your faith together so that we all have that end goal of reaching heaven. And so the goal is to take time to notice and show appreciation for even the little things done for one another. Even the little things. So many times in the previous years, when husbands and wives talk to me, I hear so often, he or she never appreciates what I do. I never hear, thank you. I never get shown appreciation. She doesn't tell me how much she appreciates what I do for the family. And it drags them down. And what ends up happening is they end up shutting down for whatever reason, and then they're not talking to each other anymore. And they may not even realize or know why the one isn't talking, and so their mind goes wild with all these different things, and before long a big fight blows up that didn't have to happen. The goal, make it your goal. Do things together. Even if it's not something that it's your interest and it's not his or her interest, create a new interest that both of you enjoy and do it together, or try something new together and see what that does for your relationship. Why do husbands and wives not communicate effectively? Perhaps it's because they feel they're being manipulated. So they don't want to talk. They don't want to communicate. They don't want to say how they're feeling because they're worried it's going to be turned in on themselves. This picture, for those in the back, you may not be able to read it, shows a husband and wife back to back with angry faces. And the husband says, if you really cared, you would, ... fill in the blank. She says, if you really loved me, you would, ... But they're both thinking it. They're not communicating. They're thinking it. If you really loved me, you would. Well, maybe it's because they feel manipulated. You know, there's an old joke, and I mentioned to you this last week. The joke says, husband is the head, but the wife is the neck that turns the head. And while that may be funny, and it's only funny because we see that happening, it describes a dysfunctional relationship that doesn't honor God. That's not the way God designed it. Remember, the husband is the head. The biblical concept is husband is the head, but the wife is the neck that supports the head. And that goes back to Genesis 2:18. She is that suitable helper. You to your husband are the only thing on earth that God created that fills his needs, that fills in the gaps and covers up his blind spots. You are that suitable helper for him. You are the neck that supports the head. So why does a husband feel like he's being manipulated? When we listen to these things, maybe it's because he is. Maybe he was silenced into submission or compliance by a domineering wife. 1 Peter 3:3-6 addresses this issue. Maybe because he's not leading his family. Maybe he's not stepping up and being decisive. Maybe he's not being the leader. And so experience after experience of his wife having to lead so the children don't rise up and lead has placed him in a role where now he feels he's being manipulated. Maybe he is. 1 Peter 3:6 tells us Sarah couldn't obey if Abraham wasn't leading. Sarah obeyed Abraham because he was leading. And while it's not the biblical concept, what happens if the husband doesn't step up and do his God-given role of leadership, the wife will step into that role and lead. And if the wife doesn't, and there's children involved, the children will rise up and lead. And we have all known and seen families such as that, and it is very dysfunctional. So when the husband says he's feeling manipulated, maybe it's because he is. And rather than say, no, you're crazy, maybe we need to ask him, what can we do to fix that? What can you and your wife do to reverse that? Why does the wife feel like she's being manipulated? The simple answer is maybe she is. Maybe the husband only shows interest in her when he wants something for himself. Remember the picture? He says, if you really cared, you would... ... fill in the blank. How often have we heard people say that? Well, if she really loved me, if he really loved me, then he would... Anytime I hear that, my first question is, have you told them that? Have you said that? What normally follows? I'm not saying it happens 100% of the time, but what normally follows? Well, if he really loved me, he would know. If she really cared, she would know. Well, have you told them that? Ask it again. Have you told them that? Well, no. Well, husbands, when we're told to live with our wives in an understanding way, both husband and wife need to understand we're not mind readers. We often will know things about one another through practice and experience, but we don't know what's on one another's minds 100% of the time at any given time during the day. That comes through communication. That comes through talking. So why does a husband or wife feel they're being manipulated? Maybe they are. Maybe their spouse is holding something over their head. Maybe their spouse is doing something and only showing interest when he or she wants something out of them. You know what that does? Is it contributes to resentment in a marriage. It contributes to distrust and animosity. And when there's children involved, don't think for a second the children aren't catching or picking up on that. They see the resentment. They see the conflict. They see the outright animosity between mommy and daddy. Communication is sharing, not controlling. Notice with me Romans 12 and verse 10. It says, be devoted to one another in brotherly love. Give preference to one another in honor. Again, if this is the type of relationship we're to have one to another, as brothers and sisters in Christ, it definitely describes how it should be between husband and wife. That we ought to give one another preference. We ought to be ready to give up anything for our husband or our wife. Communication is sharing, it's not control. Why do husband and wife fail to communicate effectively? Sometimes they say they're too busy to take the time. Well, I'm busy. And both husband and wife may have a career that is demanding and needs their attention. But if you're too busy to talk with one another, you're too busy. Same as I often say, if you're too busy to study God's Word, you're too busy. But if we're too busy for one another, the one that we are to cling to become one flesh with, if we're too busy for that, we're too busy. Communication takes a commitment of time. In Colossians 4, 5 to 6. Some will see people say, I have no time. Ephesians 5:16 says, making the most of your time because the days are evil. This is what Colossians 4, 5 to 6 says as well. Redeem the time. Make the most of your time. To say, I have no time is an easy excuse for couples to close off their hearts from one another. I'll deal with it later. Well, what happens when that later eventually, inevitably happens? All those things start rolling up. And do they come out in a nice way? Maybe, sometimes, depending on the circumstances. But how often does it come out in an angry, wrathful way? A lot more than it comes out in a nice, easy, relaxed conversation. Than if we had taken the time to spend time and get to talk with one another about the things that are bothering one another, the things that we're upset about, the things that need changed, instead of waiting for it all to snowball into one massive argument. And things are said on both sides, and hearts are broken. We have time to watch TV, to play video games, ride our bikes, take walks, whatever it is. When it's something that interests us and it's something we really want to do, think about it. We will make the time to do it. Right? Even if we set aside our own personal comfort, our own whatever it is, our own expense, we will take the time to do the things that we want to do. So when our spouse wants our time, why would we not give it to him or her? We make time for the things that we want to do. We need to make time to attend to our family, to attend to the things that are on one another's minds, and give a listening ear to it. I would say don't be a Martha. Luke chapter 10, 38 to 42, you might remember this account. Jesus went into the home of Mary and Martha. And as he's sitting there with them, Mary is sitting at his feet listening to his teachings. Martha's busy in the kitchen, and certainly those things needed to be done, not taking away from those chores. But she comes to Jesus and says, "Make Mary help me." Remember his response? "Martha, Martha, you're worried and bothered by so many things." And he says they're not important. He said, Mary has chosen the important thing. I'm not with you forever. She's at my feet listening. That's where you ought to be too, but instead you're worried and bothered by all these peripheral material things that don't matter right now. And sometimes that happens in our marriage, where we're focused and busy on all the peripheral things and we're not focused on what really matters, what's right in front of us. Whether it's a spouse who's upset or our children and spending time with them. It's so easy to get involved in all the other things. Don't be Martha. Don't be worried and bothered by so many things that you neglect what's right in front of you and is of the utmost importance at that time. Why do husbands and wives not communicate effectively? Sometimes, very often, it's because they don't want to hurt the other person. They know what they have to say is going to cause some unpleasantness. It might even cause some alarm to the other person. But we need to communicate it. Proverbs 27, 5-6 says it's better than to have open rebuke than love concealed. It's better to have open rebuke than love concealed. Proverbs 27, verse 17, and also 28, 23 speaks of that person that will willingly take the person aside and tell them what's on their mind, even if it's hurtful. And that's where that phrase, truth hurts, comes from. We often say the truth hurts. Sometimes a helpful response from our spouse hurts, but is needed. We have to remember our spouse ought to have our best interest at their heart. And if they don't, that's one of those things that breeds that mistrust. But if we trust our spouse, when we know they have our best interest at heart, then we know that when they have something to tell us, we need to know it. You know, here in this picture is a woman with her hand up, and the guy's about to talk, and she's just saying nope. Probably because she knows whatever he's going to say is going to be hurtful, or whatever she has to say might be hurtful to him. And so we don't talk because we don't want to hurt the other person. Here's a simple picture that kind of depicts in a very simple way the kind of help that I'm talking about that sometimes hurts. Have you ever had someone tell you, maybe it's not just your spouse but a friend, have you ever had someone tell you got something in your teeth? And they're making that gesture, and you're going, oh no, it's so embarrassing. It's embarrassing for the person telling you, it's embarrassing for the person receiving it. But it's for their good, so you don't go and continue being embarrassed, not walking around talking to people, smiling, and not knowing there's something that's going to draw their eye to your teeth. Husbands and wives, and a very simple thing that you can do is let one another know they need help. This is a simple way you can help. Do you want to help your spouse? Sometimes help hurts. Are you willing to accept help from your spouse? Sometimes the spouse is very willing to help, right? But sometimes we're not willing to accept it. No, I don't want to hear that. No, I don't want to change that. No, I don't want to do something different. Are you willing to help your spouse? And then the next question you need to ask yourself is, are you willing to accept help from your spouse, even if it exposes your shortcoming, even if it exposes your fault or a sin? Are you willing to accept help? Humble hearts are necessary in order to give correction, and humble hearts are necessary in order to receive correction from our spouse. In Romans 12:16, and we're going to read this again in just a few minutes, it says, "Be of the same mind toward one another. Do not be haughty in mind, but associate with the lowly. Do not be wise in your own estimation." Again, we often look at this passage as talking about how we deal with one another, our brethren, our brothers and sisters, and how we deal with those in the world. That we're to be of the same mind toward one another. That's that unity Jesus prayed for in the garden in John 17. That brethren would be of one mind. And he says, don't be haughty in mind. That's arrogant. Don't be arrogant in your mind. Associate with the lowly. Don't be wise in your own estimation. He's saying, don't think more of yourself than you are. You know, to shorten a story that we're probably all familiar with, but one I think of anytime I think of someone not thinking too much of what they are, and you've probably all heard it or even seen, there's a video of it, of a commander of a Navy battleship telling someone, you need to move, correct your course now. And the person said on the radio, comes back and says, no, you correct your course. I'm so-and-so, commander of this vessel of the U.S. Navy. You correct your course. And they say, we're a lighthouse. Correct your course. You know, you probably have heard that story. There's a guy who thought a lot of himself. I'm in the U.S. Navy. I'm the commander of the ship. You correct your course. And they're saying, all right, we're a lighthouse. If it works for our brethren, if this is the way we're to treat one another, then it definitely fits with the way we ought to treat our spouse. That we give him or her preference. We don't think too highly of ourselves that we're going to treat them in a haughty and arrogant way. That we have that humbleness of mind, that we're ready to receive and give instruction. So a solution to these problems, spouses must help each other know that they always have each other's best interest at heart. And sometimes it's not enough to say it, but we have to show it. Because in those heated moments, we often don't remember the words that our spouse spoke. We remember what they did. And if the actions don't fit the words, that's what we're going to remember. That's what we're going to recall in those heated battles come up. Show your spouse that you have their best interest at heart. Show them through your words and your actions. 1 Corinthians 13:5, Ephesians 5:33, Colossians 3:18 and 19, all passages we have read in the last couple of weeks. The way we put them into practice is showing our spouse how much they mean to us, even when it comes to the little things. So the goal, show preference to each other. Husbands, show your wife preference. Wives, show your husband's preference. Try that out and see what it does for your communication of how you end up talking to each other. Take time out to talk to each other. Talking, recreation, hobbies, etc. Get to know one another. I'm not a big advocate of, I'm not going to come out and say this is the best way, that at the end of the day you must sit at a table together and talk together as a family. My family growing up, we did that off and on. So there are times in our family we did that, there are times that we didn't. But something that Becky and I have strived to do in our relationship is that we do that with our children. And there are special occasions. There are times we enjoy just eating a meal in front of the TV or watching a movie together or whatever it is. But for the most part, it's a way for us to unwind and talk to each other at the close of the day. We try to do it at breakfast and at dinner. And I know there are couples that can't do that. And so I'm not telling you that's the best way. Growing up, we didn't always do that. But we found other ways when we didn't do that. My family had other ways. My dad was great at sitting us down at the close of the night before we were sent off to bed to talk to us or to study with us from God's Word. If it didn't happen at the table, it happened at another time. And so I'm not advocating for any one particular way, but telling you, find a way that works for you and your family, that you sit down and you take time to talk, both you and your spouse, and you as parents with your children. It makes a world of difference. Strengthen each other and learn that as husbands and wives, our goal is to help each other get to heaven. Communication is the key that strengthens the tie that binds us in that marriage relationship. It will reduce drama and stress from your marriage. Just as we can sit there and scream at a book or a television set and say, that wouldn't have happened if there had been good communication. Remember that when it comes to your own life and your own relationship. Those drama things wouldn't be forced, they wouldn't be contrived if we just simply talked it out. A marriage without communication is like a car without fuel, or as Richard told me recently, without oil. A car without fuel or oil is not going to go very far for very long. It will sputter and die. And your relationship without communication, it will sputter and die. Here's a couple on the slide. For those who may not be able to read it all in the back, where she says, you always, ... He says, you never, ... fill in the blanks. This is a combination of all these different things where communication should have been there, snowballing into that heated conflict. And it wouldn't have happened had they been talking. I want to close with what I said was our text from Romans 12, 9 to 13, 16. I want you to look with me with some things here. It says, let love be without hypocrisy. Abhor what is evil. Cling to what is good. That is, sincerity without hypocrisy and goodness ought to be what our marriage is built on. It says, be devoted to one another in brotherly love. Give preference to one another in honor. New King James says, kind affection and preference to one another in honor there in verse 10. Not lagging behind in diligence, fervent in spirit, serving the Lord. Diligent service to each other and to God. He says, contributing to the needs of the saints, practicing hospitality. Be of the same mind toward one another. Do not be haughty in mind, but associate with the lowly. Do not be wise in your own estimation. We rejoice, I think I skipped verse 12. Rejoicing in hope, persevering in tribulation, devoted to prayer. So there's joyful hope, persevering in trials and prayer, sympathetic giving, hospitality, and there ought to be unity in our marriage relationship. When these things are the building blocks and the foundation of our marriage, things will go a lot more smoothly. The goal that I want to leave you with is to put God first in your marriage. Colossians 3, 12 and 19. Make your spouse's well-being your priority. Become good communicators. And that begins with listening so that you might know how to respond. Never refuse to forgive each other. In Colossians 3, 12 to 14. There's an old saying that says, forget injuries, never forget kindness. And as husbands and wives, we need to take that to heart. Don't remember the injury. Forget those. But never forget the kindness. Show appreciation to one another. Make time to communicate with your spouse, as it'll strengthen your marriage. It'll reduce drama, stress, and conflict. And as we do these things, let us strive together to be the husbands and wives God wants us to be. This morning, if you're not a Christian, you need to be. Before you can put God first in your marriage, you must put God first in your life. To repent of your sins, to be baptized for the forgiveness of those sins, rising from the waters, a new creature, walking in newness of life, as Romans 6:4 says. If you are a Christian this morning, not living the way you should, perhaps a husband or wife, not living with your spouse the way that you should, now's the time to make correction. Now's the time to make it right before your spouse and before God. Come forward now and let your request be made known while we stand.